Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the podcast for Without Spot or Blemish Ministry. So glad you're here for today's live stream. Tonight, Jeff rejoins us to continue our discussion about technology. This episode is entitled LSD and the Strange Origins of Silicon Valley, the Drive Toward the Ghost in the Machine. So we've got another really creepy technology-related subject to talk about, and I want to go ahead and welcome Jeff. How you doing, Jeff?
Doing well, Doug. Thanks for having me on again. Good to
So
be back.
So glad you're here. We had great reception of your last podcast. So glad you're here again, and we thank you for that. So we are going to discuss LSD's role not only in society during the 60s, some say due to a government experiment, but we won't go into that conspiracy, but how the fathers of personal computing participated in its use and had drug-enhanced experiences as part of what influenced them at the start of Silicon Valley, and how this situation remains so in many ways until this day. We will get technical about LSD. We'll find out who the creator was, what it's like to be on it, and how it mimics another trait of demonic possession, that is, the characteristics of schizophrenia. Then Jeff will take over and take us on a journey to discover how LSD-induced trips kept the Silicon Valley Titans on the pathway to AI and neural networks and the ghost in the machine. And yes, they were talking about that at the very beginning when they still had tape-driven machines. They were talking about this final outcome, just like that movie Metropolis in the 20s made it out to be. They were talking about this in the 70s too. This was not anything that was new to them. The stuff we're seeing now, they were already thinking about it back then. And Jeff's going to talk a lot about that with us. But before we begin, let's pray. Father God, we just praise you and thank you for tonight's podcast. We just come against any demonic spirits that would try to interfere with Jeff or myself. We bind them up, command them to leave us in the mighty name of Jesus, especially spirits of fear that would come against us or the listeners. We're not trying to put fear on people, but we're just trying to tell them the truth about what's going on in the world of technology, what goes on to this day, and how technology is being used not only to seemingly help us, but to actually hurt us all in the end. And so we thank you and praise you for directing and guiding this podcast and guiding us as to what to say and what to speak and helping us to be a blessing to all those who listen, Father. We give you all the praise and glory for that. We bind up any demonic spirits from interfering with it on our end or at the end of the listener. Any convoluting of the message out of our mouths or in the ears of the listener, we bind up and come against in the mighty name of Jesus. And we loose that only God's Holy Spirit would be the one to minister to each and every person that's watching now in the chat room and as well as in the future when this airs later on. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. We want to say hi to everybody that's here so far. We say hi to Carol, Nina, Melissa, Chucky, Gary, KMD, Warrior Spirit, and Barb Justice. So glad you guys are here today. I'm seeing that I'm not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming. If you guys are experiencing any kind of problems, just let us know, and we'll try to resolve it. So let us know how your signal is. All right, so I want to go ahead and just get on to the message, and beginning with this idea that Jeff told me about. He said, look, did you know that the people at the beginning of Silicon Valley, they were all doing LSD? And, I remember lots of stories about people in society in the 60s were high on LSD. I've heard stories that the government or the CIA actually introduced it to the party scene and the drug scene as a means of experimentation. There was a lot of experimentation I learned later on that went on with LSD with regard to alcoholism and schizophrenics. They were trying to find some medicinal use for LSD ever since its invention, which we'll talk about, by Albert Hofmann, who was a Swiss chemist, and we'll go more into him in a minute. But there was so much experimentation going on with this drug, and it's hallucinatory. So let's learn about it first. So what is LSD? It's lysergic acid diethylamide. It's hard to say. Also known colloquially as acid. It's a hallucinogenic drug. Effects typically include altered thoughts, feelings, and awareness of one's surroundings. Many users see or hear things that do not exist, which is akin to what schizophrenics go through. We're going to talk about that a little bit too. Dilated pupils, increased blood pressure, increased body temperature are typical. Effects typically begin within half an hour, and can last up to 12 hours. It is used mainly as a recreational drug or for spiritual reasons. And I've heard of people using acid and saying they saw different religious figures, including Jesus or Buddha or any other one of the Hindu gods. It just kind of depends. It's almost like taking peyote, as the American Indian Native Americans would take peyote to go on their trips, their vision quests, as they were called. So it has a similar effect to that. Some people categorize acid and peyote in a similar category. We'll see more about that here in a second too. So that's what LSD is. Now, for us as believers, we know that we've all heard the word pharmakeia, which is the root word for pharmacy. It's a Greek word. And here in Revelation, it talks about how the merchants of the earth, were the great men of the earth, by their sorceries would they deceive all nations. And in so doing, what is that? What is the root word for sorcery there? It's actually pharmakeia. I didn't mean to cover my whole head there. It's actually pharmakeia. That's the root word. So let's actually find out about pharmakeia from the Strong's Concordance. So there you have it, the word pharmakeia. It's the root. It comes from the word is medication. It means medication. And it also means magic. So by extension, sorcery or witchcraft. Another word it comes from is pharmakeus, and it is a spell-giving potion. A druggist or a pharmacist or a poisoner, a magician or a sorcerer. So we see that when you drug somebody, it's tied in with magic and sorcery. And in my view, that's why these people are actually having visions of things that don't exist. It's because by doing a mind-altering substance like that, they're actually opening the door to the occult. They're opening the door to demonic spirits that are manipulating them and showing them things in the spirit world that they wouldn't otherwise see. And we're going to see about schizophrenia. Those people experience similar things. They see people that aren't there, or things, or frightening things into the spirit world. And a lot of times people with schizophrenia have had past experiences with mind-altering drugs, or they participate in the occult. They did seances. They handled Ouija boards. They did all sorts of activities that open the door to demonic oppression and possession. And that's why they're almost not just allowed, but forced to see through the looking glass into the spirit world of all these demons that are harassing and tormenting them. And when you first do something like LSD, the trip seems fun and great. Not everybody that I've heard talk about has had a fun or great trip, but sometimes they do. But it's not always going to remain that way. Satan will come as an angel of light in the beginning, and then he's going to twist it all up, and you're going to have some really terribly bad experiences in the end. And it's not anything that you really want to play with, that is for sure. So anytime you do pharmakeia, anytime you mess with drugs or the occult, chances are you're going to see into the spirit world, and you might not be able to stop it. It just depends on how much the demons want to torment you after you participate in drug use, LSD type use, or anything that's mind altering. It's extremely, extremely dangerous. So what is doing LSD like? So we've described it a little bit. Let's just go ahead and take a look at this clip, and you're going to see what some people have to say about it who are obvious users. But I'm going to begin it. It's going to play some kind of, it's got a super long intro. I should have edited it out before I brought it up, but we'll continue to talk about it for a minute while it spools up. So see how it's saying the mind benders. It's a mind bending activity. The reason why back in the 70s, these little movies like this, they had all of these colors and flashing lights and strobe type effects, was because that supposedly enhanced their trip, or that's stuff that they would actually see when using it. Okay, so our video is beginning now.
Is defined as an apparent perception, as by sight or hearing, for which there is no real or external cause. From this word is derived the name given to a special group of drugs, the hallucinogens.
I don't usually see something that's an actual real thing that I could describe as, Sometimes, one time I saw a lot of faces. Just all these faces appeared in front of me. And they were children's faces and oriental faces and old faces and just all kinds of different faces in front of me. And one time I looked in the mirror and I saw just my face just went through all these changes of different emotions and ages, and you know, I could feel all of the things that I saw.
Among these drugs, the hallucinogens, are included mescaline, a chemical taken from the peyote cactus, psilocybin, extracted from a variety of Mexican mushroom, DMT, synthesized from the compound tryptamine, and of course, LSD-25, a derivative of lysergic acid and currently the best known of the hallucinogens. From the very beginnings of unrecorded time, men have reached for substances in the world around them that would alter, extend, and materially change their perception of reality.
Isn't that the truth? They used a lot of these things to unite and have Congress with demons, honestly. And people continue to do things like this to this day. Now, although LSD was created in the 20th century, there's been different types of mind-altering substances used throughout history, as that movie has shown us. And so I want to actually introduce you to the creator of it. His name is Albert Hofmann, and he was a Swiss scientist known best for being the first known person to synthesize, ingest, and learn of the psychedelic effects of LSD. He was the first person to isolate, synthesize, and name the principal psychedelic mushroom compounds, psilocybin and psilocin. So he had a lot of experimentation with what would become mind-altering drugs such as LSD and the mushrooms and whatnot. And so if you watch them, there's plenty of videos on YouTube. There's actually a movie called Hoffman's Potion made by a Canadian movie consortium. And you can watch that movie and see that he really speaks highly of it. I mean, he thinks it was a great thing that he did. And one of the things he said toward the end of his life was that he felt like it was... He said, Hoffman continued to take small doses of LSD throughout much of his life and always hoped to find a use for it. In his memoir, he emphasized it as a sacred drug. I see the true importance of LSD in the possibility of providing material aid to meditation aimed at the mystical experience of a deeper, comprehensive reality. So he really, to the end of his life, he promoted it, you know, probably as its creator. He really believed in it. But he had a really bad experience with it that Jeff had shared with us that I want to tell you about. And this was a quote from him. He said, when he took it, a demon had invaded me, had taken possession, my body, mind, and soul. I jumped and screamed, trying to free myself from him, but then sank down and lay helpless on the sofa. The substance with which I had wanted to experiment had vanquished me. It was the demon that scornfully triumphed over my will. So in this quote, he's admitting that there's a demonic spirit behind it. Now, throughout his life, that's not what he said. But in that moment of truth, maybe that was the first or second time he took it, he had this realization of the demonic aspect of it. So the final thing I want to talk about before we bring Jeff in, and I'm sorry for going on so long, I know everybody wants to hear him because he's got a lot to tell us, but is the aspect of LSD where it actually replicates schizophrenia, and which is, again, for us as believers in Jesus Christ that believe in demons, that believe in the power of the name of Jesus to cast demons out, we believe that schizophrenics are under demonic possession or oppression, and that's what's causing them to experience so many problems. And the fact that there is such a similarity between what people experience on this drug LSD and schizophrenia just further serves to prove the fact that they're both putting you into a state of being demonized. So let's go ahead and take a look at this video really quick.
I spent many years in Saskatchewan, which I'm in an ambivalent way very fond. I went there as clinical director of this large mental hospital. I enjoyed those distant days in Saskatchewan. New chemicals allow us to experience some of the unbelievably unpleasant and sometimes quite terrifying mental agonies of the schizophrenic patient. To some extent, to put ourselves in his shoes for a few hours. These people have terrible experiences. That's why they're so tense. We know that seemingly small errors made in caring for them will cause that tension to rise. We are able to hold our world constant. For the schizophrenic person, this constancy breaks down, or begins to break down, which is worse because of the uncertainty. We've conducted hundreds of experiments using different substances to produce schizophrenic-like symptoms in ourselves. I put myself through more than 15 experiments using everything from ololuqui to adrenalutin.
Okay, so he's talking about how he himself put himself through experiments in order to draw a correlation of what it must feel like to be schizophrenic. And for me, that's just evidence of if you're experiencing the same thing as a schizophrenic, you've been demonized. And I wonder about these people that did all these experiments with drugs under the ruse of science, how they must have spent their whole lives in a state of utter deception throughout their whole lives. And now, Jeff, I think we're ready to go ahead and transfer to the idea of you talking about John Markoff. And I want to ask you, would you like me to show the little video of him first or just let you tell the tale?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to show the movie, and then I could talk a bit about his recent book and some of the findings that we can take from the book on the influence of LSD on creativity in Silicon Valley.
That's a deal. So I'll go ahead and do that now.
All of the technologies that we think of as the modern internet and the personal computers were really created first in an area around Stanford University between 1960 and 1975. At the same time that there was both a vibrant counterculture and ideas about augmenting human intelligence, augmenting the human mind, were being pursued both by the technologists, and they were sort of alive in a lot of the counterculture community that was taking place around Stanford. The technology didn't emerge in the vacuum. Technology is actually mediated by things that are going on in society, whether they be politics or economics or culture. In 1965, 1966, there were two men on either side of the Stanford campus. One was John McCarthy and one was Doug Engelbart. McCarthy was leading a research group that wanted to replace the human mind. He was exploring these technologies called artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence at that time, the researchers thought that they could create a computerized artificial intelligence in a decade. On the other side of the campus, Engelbart was doing something different. He was trying to augment the human mind. He was trying to build a set of technologies that would allow humans to cooperate more quickly and invent things more efficiently. I've really struggled to try to understand what the relationship is between the use of psychedelic drugs by a small community of people during the 60s and the development of computer technology. And I'm still uncomfortable by saying one led to the other. It's clear to me, however, that they both emerged at the same time, and there were aspects of each that resonated. Doug Engelbart had this idea about amplifying the human mind. The people who were exploring LSD during the 1960s wanted to expand the human mind. Those were very similar ideas, and the impetus was related, and they resonated back and forth. And I think it's possible to say that each side drew on the other for sort of vision and inspiration. The threads that were emerging in California on the edge of the United States in the 60s led to both, and I think it's not a coincidence. They both happened, within the space of 5 miles.
See the pyramid triangle theme?
The interesting thing about Engelbart is that he was willing to experiment with all kinds of ideas, from psychodrama to psychedelic drugs to new computer technologies to ideas that were taken from Mao's Red Guards. And so it was a wild and unusual time. I mean, if you went into SRI back in the 60s, on one floor you'd have these guys with white shirts and pocket protectors who were designing smart missiles. And on Engelbart's floors you'd have, oriental rugs and pillows and yoga workstations and, wine and drugs in the refrigerator. Just a very different cultural atmosphere. And out of that came most of the important ideas that would become personal computing. In 1968, in December, Engelbart sort of brought everything that his research group had developed during the 60s together in one just amazing demonstration that was given at Brooks Hall at the Joint Qual Computer Conference. He had a huge screen, a video screen, which was very unusual at that point to have an interactive video screen. And he sat up on stage and he had a mouse in one hand, a keyboard. He had a display for himself. He had this thing called a chord key set that allowed him to enter textual information with his left hand while he was mousing with his right. And on the screen he had windows and hypertext and all the visual stuff that would become sort of the modern computer interface. And you have to remember that at that time, computing was not interactive. You would take your stack of cards and you would hand them to the sort of high priest of the data center. And Engelbart blew all that up. He showed 1,000 of the best computer scientists in the country a very different model of computing. And everything was different after that demonstration. It was called the mother of all demos. And what's significant is that a lot of his ideas emerged not just from sort of a pure set of technology events, but from this real sort of open exploratory group that he put together in the midst of both a political and a drug counterculture.
Wow. Wow, Jeff. There's so much to unpack out of all that. Where to begin?
Yeah, thanks for showing that video, Doug. Markov wrote a really phenomenal book called What the Dormouse Said. The subtitle is How the 60s Counterculture Shaped the Personal Computer Industry. This book is really a deep dive into how closely intertwined LSD and hallucinogenic drug experimentation and scientific experimentation, how closely the two were mixed together in the culture of scientific research that was coming out of the top research centers in technology at the time. And these research centers were all very well funded, staffed by the top people. And the thing we have to understand about what was going on at this time is that these were all congregating on the San Francisco Peninsula, which is just south of San Francisco, in what we now know as Silicon Valley, where the counterculture was really sort of spilling over from San Francisco. And they were trying to reconcile their, what you might call sort of straight-laced engineering impulses with the culture that was coming in from the sort of the hippies and the alternative lifestyles and the new ageism that was just 20 miles north of them. And what you found was they exploited, I think, what they consider to be scientific advances in chemistry that, what Albert Hoffman would call a scientific advance in chemistry, what we know as, mind-bending hallucinogenic drugs that lead to, spiritual experiences. And they said, how do we make this systematic and how do we combine this with our science? There was an institute called the International Foundation for Advanced Study, based there, I think in Menlo Park or Palo Alto, right around Stanford University. The institute at that time in the 60s led more than 350 people through controlled LSD experiences. So the question is, how did this get into the labs of hardware engineers that were making microchips for computers and semiconductors? Basically, the idea was to cure the problem of what they called Midwest engineer syndrome, which is, you imagine these guys at the time in their standard uniforms were white lab coats and glasses and pocket protectors and looking very uptight and just sort of geeky dudes. And the idea was to how do we get them to break out of their shell to help boost their creativity?
Think
The answer
outside
to
the
that
box.
Right, exactly, to have controlled LSD experiments. So what we saw happening at the time was the leaders of a lot of these institutes, like Doug Engelbart, were taking their teams on Tuesdays and Thursdays to offsite centers in the woods around San Francisco, and they were sitting around and dropping acid. And then they were being led back into the labs on high on acid and asked to come up with creative ways to think about man-machine symbiosis and topics that we now know as artificial intelligence and neural networks, where man's limitations in their cognitive processes could be augmented by a machine. The mother of all demos that Markov just talked about in the video was really way ahead of its time, because they were already talking about in 1968 things like that we all know, like the graphical user interface, which is a point and click interface that we all have on our personal computers.
It's just crazy.
Yeah, and navigating a screen with your mouse, instantaneous calculations, and an interconnected web, which was the next step. And McCarthy was already talking about creating a system where
Oh man.
and the government had funded a system called ARPANET, which later became, which we all know, that was closely tied to all of these leaders, these really seminal figures in Silicon Valley, like John McCarthy and Doug Engelbart, that were dropping acid to create a system where you could link all the remote terminals across major research centers. So the early internet in the 1960s was actually called the ARPANET, and that system linked Stanford Research Institute, UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah through a system of patches where they could all talk to each other.
So I guess Al Gore didn't invent the internet after all.
Well, Al Gore claimed he invented a lot of things, but he definitely didn't come up with the internet. So I want to take you through another figure who Steve Jobs acknowledges as one of the most important people, one of his most important influences. He wrote a book called The Whole Earth Catalog, which is similar to the Zen motorcycle. There's a book called The Zen of Motorcycle Repair or something like that. And the Beat, On the Road and the sort of the Beat writers' books is considered a really kind of canonical work.
Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I tried to read it. I think I got to chapter 2, and right out of college I couldn't take it.
That's exactly it. So if you can think of that genre of writing from the 1960s, I was trying to inspire an alternative way of thinking about living. The Whole Earth Catalog is one of the most important works in that library. So the writer of that book was a gentleman named Stuart Brand. And I just want to read a quote by Steve Jobs when he gave his commencement speech at Stanford in 2005 about this book. He said, "When I was young, there was an amazing publication called The Whole Earth Catalog, which is one of the Bibles of my generation. It was sort of like Google in paperback form, 35 years before Google came along. It was idealistic and overflowing with neat tools and great notions." So before this book was written, Stuart Brand had a series of LSD experiences, closely working with these institutes around the Bay Area. And I just want to read one of the quotes where he told the story of what happened to him when he actually went on an acid trip taking LSD. So he said, this is an account of Stuart Brand taking LSD. "He was asked to look at murals and yin-yang symbols, but he found nothing interesting in them. He walked to the bathroom and found the experience dizzying and humiliating. It appeared to him that he was holding a child's penis. He was shown a picture of Christ and began to feel manipulated." So you get an idea here from reading these quotes that a lot of the seminal works, these books that were so influential in driving creativity, a lot of the engineering culture in the Bay Area, were coming from hallucinogenic experiences with really odd, really bizarre hallucinations like the ones that Stuart Brand had. So he wrote the whole Earth catalog, which became essentially the Bible for people like Steve Jobs and many other engineers and generations of engineers after him.
Wow, it's interesting that, they always see some kind of Messiah, a Jesus figure, and of course the perverted pedophile experience he had there too. But, you hear a lot of testimonies from former witches that they were able to transcendentally meditate, and they would always end up running into this Messiah figure that they thought was Jesus, and it was always a demon masquerading. And I think that's what happened in every case where you take a mind-altering drug and you run into Jesus. You're running into a demon or an angel, a fallen angel acting as an angel of light. That's what these people did, and they were thick as thieves with demons. And speaking of Steve Jobs, everybody's heard and seen how the very first computer they sold for $666.66. So they even had that represented, the number of the beast represented in the price of the very first computer they sold.
And if you open up that slide there, Doug, we can see what the spiritual philosophy of the whole Earth catalog was. So they said, we are as gods and might as well get used to it. So far remotely done power and glory as via government, big business, formal education, church has succeeded to the point where gross obscure actual gains. In response to this dilemma and to these gains, a realm of intimate personal power is developing. Power of the individual to conduct his own education, find his own inspiration, shape his own environment, and share his adventure with whoever is interested. Tools that aid this process are sought and promoted by the whole Earth catalog. When we read
That's the modern internet.
Exactly right. And when we dig a little deeper, what's actually underlying that message?
You can be as God.
What tools do we need to be our own gods?
Yes. It's the same thing in the garden, the promise of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
And the very foundations of personal computing were really based on this philosophy. How do we become better human beings so that we can become our own gods? How do we leverage the power of computing and of machines so that we exceed our own limitations, God-given limitations as man? And these were really the roots of what we now know as transhumanism, where people were already thinking then in the 60s, heavily influenced by LSD. How do I take all the knowledge that I have as an engineer and create the tools that I need to become superhuman? And the whole Earth catalog we see is one of these documents that seems really innocuous on the outside, but really has an incredible amount of influence in shaping the thinking behind really powerful people at the time.
It stands to reason that their logo would be, and the name would be Apple, that a fruit with a bite out of it. It's like Eve took that first bite, and they are forwarding that idea of what happened in the garden on into the last days.
That's exactly right. And I wanted to get into one of the key documents at the time, which was published in 1962 by a gentleman named J.C.R. Licklider, who was actually one of the directors of ARPA and was one of the main colleagues of Doug Engelbart at the time. He wrote an important paper called Man-Computer Symbiosis in 1962. The goal of man-computer symbiosis, which is essentially just brain-computer interface as we know it, in sort of pop culture terms, it's actually cybernetic enhancement or a Neuralink or some sort of machine enhancement of our own brains. The basis was to merge man and machine, and to start running programs to get computers to think like people in real time and actually mimic their cognitive processes.
Wow. So even back then, they're thinking about artificial intelligence and the neural net. They're thinking of all of that stuff well before they had the full capabilities of doing it.
That's right. And a lot of the way things work in Silicon Valley is you think it up and then you make it happen. You may not have all the tools on hand, but you have the people and you have the resources and you get people to fund you. And you'll see a lot of what startup culture is on the West Coast is a lot of it's driven by just an idea. And then behind the idea are visionaries, people who, through the force of their will, are saying, I'm going to make this happen. You just give me the resources and the people. I'm going to bring this to life, bring it from 0 to 1, create something out of nothing, and then I'm gonna write the future. And already they were saying that in the 60s, and you actually find even today that a lot of startups that are being incubated in Silicon Valley and other major tech centers in the US still write papers and white papers where they outline their vision of the future. A lot of startup founders and people who are working in these companies spend a lot of time at Burning Man, pagan sort of festivals, Coachella, experimenting with drugs. Mushrooms are very common. Recreational drug use is very common to inspire the way they think about the products that they're building. And underneath all of this is very much the same philosophy that we see in the Whole Earth catalog, which is we can become our own personal gods. Tech will make our lives more convenient. Tech will slay the dragons that we have in our lives, and we can tame nature with technology.
And we can live forever.
Exactly, and we already see that now. There is an institute that belongs to Alphabet, which is the parent company for Google. They are a California institute that is dedicated to eternal life, to actually extending life and trying to create eternal human beings. And they're experimenting in the same way that they did in the 1950s and 1960s, combining pharmaceuticals with machinery.
You know, what's interesting, and you and I talked about this earlier, is the Bradley, I forget his last name now, but the movie we were talking about where he took that pill and it enhanced him to be able to use most of his mind instead of 5% of it. And it seems like there is a lot of that going on, and they're using LSD as a performance enhancer, but there are other types of drugs that are doing to where you're not necessarily hallucinating, but it's supposed to improve your abilities to function and your cognitive abilities. Have you heard about that going on in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, actually, there are a number of direct-to-consumer companies that will mail directly to your door a kit to take these drugs, which are scientifically known as nootropics, but they're basically what we saw in that movie Limitless with Bradley Cooper.
Bradley Cooper, that's right.
Exactly. They're designed to enhance your cognitive function and basically give you access to powers that you didn't know you had. And, boosting your productivity, optimizing your brain function, your metabolism, your physical prowess, basically to get you to at least feel like you're exceeding whatever natural limitations you have to achieve the goals that you want. So they've popularized that in that movie and kind of glamorized it. And just a few years later, we saw some companies coming out in Silicon Valley that are producing these drugs for commercial use. I don't know if they've actually been cleared by the FDA for commercial use, but they are available and you can buy them retail. And I think those drugs are actually a sign of bigger things, that a bigger culture of obsession with optimization, and the idea that humans can become like machines and perform like machines.
To be as God, to use machinery. I keep going back to this, but I always wondered about the iron in the clay and what it represented in the book of Revelation when it talked about the final kingdom. And it truly is a mixture of machine with humanity. And, I don't know, you and I have never talked about this, but what's the deal with all this black goo represented in movies? I know that there was a movie with Scarlett Johansson that Melissa's mentioning, where she actually becomes part of the computer. She turns to this black goo and then is absorbed by the computer at the end, I guess as a form of a representation of singularity, I suppose. But did you see that movie, and do you know what I'm talking about? It seems like that black goo's been represented in a lot of different movies. Even in The Matrix, it kind of started there where he stuck his hand into the mirror and it it became a liquid.
Yeah, when I saw that movie, Doug, I immediately thought of a term that's passed around in the software development community called wetware. And the idea is that there are bioelectric and biochemical properties in the brain that are transmitting signals all the time. And there are physical connections and electrical pulses that are moving through your brain to send messages. And the colloquial term to make that an analogy to software is called wetware. And the idea is that software should essentially function in the same way as your brain does, by creating instantaneous networking and transmission of messages across this network.
Wow.
And I just thought that that movie, Lucy, was sort of getting at what we covered the last time on our talk, the hive mind idea, which is essentially networked wetware between individuals.
Wow. Interesting. Her name was Lucy, a derivative of Lucifer.
Yeah, I didn't catch that until we talked about it.
They never hide. They
Doug,
never hide these things. They always tell you right out in the open what they're doing.
Yep, that's exactly right. I also wanted to go through an idea while we're on that topic of wetware. So one of the foundations of modern computing that happens in all machines at the root level of an operating system is called the Linux kernel. And the kernel is basically the core program at the most foundational level of any operating system, whether it's Mac or a PC. And the kernel has complete control over all processes in the machine. And so what happens within the kernel is a series of programs that sends instructions out to perform tasks like open a file, drag and drop, open an email, connect to the web, open your browser, etc. So these are all instructions that are being sent out through the kernel. What's interesting is that one of the core processes that happens on the Linux kernel is a program that's run by what is known as a daemon. And a daemon, it's spelled Daemon. It's a program that will run by itself in the background and is always listening for events that are happening on the operating system. So when an event happens, such as an email coming in or a web request is made, the daemon will kick into action to handle those events. And I just thought it was interesting that one of the core processes of any computer is something that computer pioneers had named the daemon.
And all of us have seen those when you get back an email that you've tried to send to an email address that doesn't exist, or the server doesn't know what to do with it. It comes back as a mailer daemon. I read it mailer daemon, but it really is daemon. And I guess it was a process run by the computer, an algorithm that said, okay, this isn't going to work. We got to tell that person. And you look back and it says mailer daemon on it.
That's exactly right. And I think it points to a bigger spiritual property of the computer, which is that, the early pioneers of personal computing had thought, well, what ultimately is a computer going to be for people? And there was a really influential thinker named Alan Kay who envisioned the computer as a personal dynamic medium. And those are his quotes. He wanted it to be a medium. And if we think about a computer as a transmitter for spiritual influences in our lives, it is essentially a tool for any message to be passed to us in the way that even in the occult that mediums are used. It's hard to ignore the connection between the really deliberate vision of computer pioneers to make a computer a medium and the LSD and sort of occult origins of creativity that created the personal computer.
It says it all in the language they used. It really shows that most of these people were probably steeped in the occult much more than even this superficial hearing that they were experimenting with LSD. I mean, who knows how deep down the rabbit hole this all goes with regard to the occult and those guys at Stanford. You know, it's funny how
That's
much respect Stanford gets as a university, but it was completely satanic to the core.
Yeah, a lot of what we see right now as the standard bearers for what's um, what's the elite and the scientific and engineering community coming out of Stanford was inspired by the occult. And I wanted to make a point on that. On the Whole Earth catalog, we saw that they were trying to inspire people to think as their own gods. And if you look at a lot of the internal workplace cultures of large tech companies in the San Francisco Bay Area, there is a lot of people complain about what they see to be a culture of arrogance among the engineers and the people that work there, because a lot of them think of themselves as architects of the future, and they will say, and having worked at a large tech company myself, they will hang posters on the walls that say, we're writing the future, get out of the way. And Facebook at one point had a slogan, "Move fast and break things." And there's a real culture of recklessness and arrogance that I think was inspired a lot by this thinking in the 1960s. That's just become the default culture. And in many ways, that culture's even permeated the non-tech workplace, where we actually see, a lot of the culture of Silicon Valley, and the culture of the transgenderism and transhumanism has become quite in vogue and quite trendy outside of the tech community.
It's interesting. Go fast and break things was their motto. That, like you said, they're very, very reckless, but driven to accomplish something at a breakneck speed. They figure, well, if we mess stuff up along the way, who cares? It's just collateral damage. We've really got to progress on this as quickly as possible. And they truly have. They've worked harder than us as Christians to reap the harvest. That's for sure. If we compare ourselves to them in terms of how hard they're working, we might be ashamed of ourselves, because they've kept their nose to the grindstone for Satan and to do his will, his ultimate goal, to bring us to the place, as we said last week, that where they can actually have the technological advancement to make it so we can't buy or sell without the mark. But they're going so much farther than that. To me, that's peanuts for them. That's just child's play at this point. What they're trying to do now is to create, like you said before, immortality for themselves outside of the gospel, outside of the Creator's will, outside of God's will, and they are believing, and they've been trained to believe by Satan, that they're going to win, that they're going to be able to overcome, that God has His own rules in the universe. I suppose that they think if they just figure out how to tap into those rules well enough, they can do as was said could have been done at the Tower of Babel. They could reach even unto heaven. And that's when God scattered the people by giving them all different languages. But here they are united again in one language, computer language and English, and they're trying to figure out how to bust into the heavenlies and to take God's seat, which is what Satan wanted right from the beginning. As you talk, I can just see their plan and what they're trying to do, and it makes a lot of sense. They don't want to go to hell. They want to live forever.
Yeah, you mentioned a good point. One of the mantras of tech people who are considering themselves innovators, their mantra is, how do we solve this problem? Everything is a problem that can be tackled with the right amount of technology and the right amount of creativity. The company that I mentioned before that's owned by Alphabet is called Calico. They consider aging to be a problem, and aging is a natural condition that was given to us by God, and we have biological, physiological limitations expressed in fixed age. But Calico is an institute that's well funded and backed by Alphabet, whose explicit mission is to solve the problem of age, because they think it can be overcome with the right amount of research.
Yeah, they're keeping level heads about them. Let's just try to tackle this problem, and Satan's has them convinced that, I suppose, that they can. And like you said, with the advancements in technology, why wouldn't people that either don't believe in God or hate God, why wouldn't they think that the sky's the limit with just the level of advancement that you spoke of in the last discussion we had? They've come so far so fast. Why wouldn't they think that they can't actually capture the human soul and put it into a machine, or make a body, adjust a body with machines and bionics and whatnot enough to make someone live 3, 4, 5, 600 years? Why wouldn't they think they could do that? Why wouldn't Elon Musk think things like that? You know, I'm sure he smoked a lot of pot and done LSD in his life.
Yeah, and I think there's a spirit of the idea that scientists are acting as Prometheus, and the Greek Prometheus, which is that we can become gods through knowledge and through industrial applications, and that spirit really governs a lot of the I think what the world calls optimism, but it is really just there are no limitations, there are no bounds that can't be overcome by science and research.
What is it like to deal with people in that community? What are, as a whole, I mean, you can't just throw everybody into one box and say everybody in the tech community in Silicon Valley and other places in the country, that everyone's all the same, but there probably is a common spirit to them. And what is it like to deal with them?
I find that it's a really heterogeneous community. A lot of people who are just working for a job or working for a paycheck, they are interested in developing new skills. A lot of their motivation is, I want to be a part of something that has an impact on people. Impact is actually one of the biggest career goals that people pursue when they come to a large tech company. I think there's a sort of a worship of the idea of hustling and of hacking. These are things that were really popularized by Mark Zuckerberg and by earlier founders in Silicon Valley. But there's still this obsession that with having these attributes to be successful there, and there's definitely a premium placed on having technical skills and being able to create something from nothing. There's a famous book by Peter Thiel, who was one of the first investors in Facebook and the founder of PayPal, along with Elon Musk. That book is called 0 to 1, and the idea we move something from one state to the next, which is at one state it didn't exist, it was nothing, and we brought it out of nothing into existence. So moving from 0 to 1, and I think that really captures a lot of the philosophy, the way people think.
Well, it seems to me that another characteristics of a lot of those people, especially Mark Zuckerberg and even Steve Jobs in the beginning, with the whole story of him supposedly stealing WYSIWYG from Xerox, and whatever Bill Gates did to steal whatever he stole to get DOS or whatever for Microsoft, is that there's no honor among thieves with a lot of these Silicon Valley titans. They'll take whatever they want without thought toward who they're taking it from.
There is also a culture of ruthlessness and a pure capitalist, the ruthless logic of capitalism that you see mixed with that optimism the optimism of being able to solve any problem.
We have a listener asking what Silicon Valley actually is, and it's a geographic region right outside of San Francisco where a lot of these big tech companies are headquartered, right?
Yeah, Silicon Valley is the colloquial term for the region just south of San Francisco on the peninsula, and it stretches from South San Francisco to San Jose, and everything in between that area is known as Silicon Valley, and got that name because that was the area that was producing actual silicon chips that were being put into computing hardware.
And so it stood to reason that people would put their corporate headquarters there, close to the resource they needed.
Exactly, exactly. A lot of the elite hardware engineers that at the time were building computers from scratch. Hewlett Packard was headquartered there in Mountain View. Of course, Xerox,
Sun Microsystems.
Sun Microsystems, Xerox spun off Intel Corporation from PARC, which was their internal research lab. And then these companies, which were titans of producing physical hardware, eventually, became obsolete, and then they were replaced by software companies.
I have one more question for you, and it kind of, Samson shook himself. It kind of pivots off of where we started. Is we're watching this video of this guy, and everyone else didn't really get to see it, but the demo of all demos, or whatever that was called, the mother of all demos, where he actually shows modern computing in 1968, basically. And my question to you is, the stuff that I'm using right now to be able to run a full podcast from my house with you on Skype and we're talking through YouTube, and we've got all this stuff going all at once. This is probably nothing compared to what the powers that be that have the real technology have. I mean, what we have, I've heard, is as much as 35 years behind what the powers that be have. And what do you think about that idea that the technology they've given us is so far behind what they already have made or produced?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Doug. There's actually a law that's in personal computing called Moore's Law, and Moore's Law is the idea that computing power basically just doubles every 2 years. And the reason why we're able to see technology accelerate so quickly is because the actual processing power is not really the limitation. It's more how do we organize that processing power of computers, and so we see transitioning from CPUs to GPUs, which are graphical processing units, and these are these are essentially computing units that are capable of performing supercomputer-like computations, and then going from GPUs into quantum computing. And we don't even know what to do with that computing power when it exists. We don't have enough use cases to actually take advantage of all that power. So I think once we actually have the use cases catching up with the power, we'll start to see rapid advances that we never thought were possible.
And that's when the AI and the neural networking, all of that will catch up to the power that's there to already support it. Is that what you're saying? Are you saying that we have to catch up to the amount of power that we have, and once we do, then AI and neural networking will be a reality?
It's hard for me to say. I don't want I try to stay away from definitive forecasts on when we might see events that are called the singularity. But I do think that we're able to see advances so quickly that they tend to catch us by surprise. And I think there are a lot of really influential people, including Elon Musk, that are genuinely fearful of artificial intelligence because they know that the computing power is there to be able to support the most advanced states of artificial intelligence. Just have some limitations right now on, like we talked about in the last time, on quality data. And also that there are ethical constraints that are being imposed internally within these companies. But the question is, when we lift those ethical constraints, what's actually stopping us? When people say to themselves, we don't really need to hold ourselves back anymore because we have existential requirements that we need to take on with maximum computing power. And when we optimize for solving those problems, we don't know how far it can go.
Well, you mentioned ethical constraints, and I think about the whole world of cloning, and that sheep Dolly was cloned and whatnot, and they're, as far as we know, they say they're not cloning human beings, but I just can't believe that they're not. I always believe the worst in these situations, that what they show us is all seemingly ethical and above board, but what they're doing behind the scenes, we just can't even measure it. That's my view of that in the area of cloning or of what satanic covens do with children and all the pedophilia and all that garbage. Like what we see on the surface is just scratching the surface. And I wonder the same about things that we've seen in science fiction. You know, while you were talking, I put up a lot of movies and science fiction movies, and you know, just thinking about what they could be doing now already, that they're ready to do, that once they can get the world to agree to the level of lowered ethics that would be required in order for them to advance it in society as a whole, that they're just waiting to drop that bomb once we're all softened to whatever it is that they're going to present.
Yeah, we only have to imagine a scenario where the urgency of introducing some solution that requires a major ethical compromise supersedes any reservations we might have about the actual ethical consequences of that solution. We make compromises every day just for convenience. And we talked about in IoT devices and all of our conveniences and using free consumer tools on the internet. We give up a lot of things. We surrender them to the companies for the sake of convenience, and have those companies do the heavy lifting for us and to think for us, so that we don't have to, and we can conserve our brain power and our energy to focus on other things like you know, convenience and the pursuit of, you know, leisure and things like that. If we were to make a large scale decision as a society and, you know, entire populations to just say, you know, we're comfortable with giving this up if we can get this solution, especially if we enter a crisis scenario, a major crisis scenario, the tech will be willing and ready. And it's only just a few steps to introduce something that we never thought, you know, we would have seen in our lifetimes.
Well, you know, you can see the same thing that you're talking about with the whole, I don't know what to call it without getting flagged, but you know, what's going on today that has everybody staying home is that they're talking about introducing a cure, we'll call it, that the whole world will have to take at some point. I've heard certain people say it that way, and they're getting us into a state of fear to where we would drop our guard and be willing to take on such a quote cure, even though there could be very negative consequences to the so-called cure, if you get what I'm saying.
That's exactly right. And when you curb our freedom to work and you curb our freedom to do things that we normally do, to go see friends and family outside of our homes, people start to feel like that they will make all kinds of compromises to have those freedoms again. And so we don't really know where that's going to go in terms of what we're willing to surrender.
Wow. So you can see that process they're putting us through on so many levels, including the computing level. And I just want to talk about one final subject. I know I kind of sounded like I was going to close before, but this applies to a lot of channels right now. We were talking about algorithms that they write. And I noticed that my viewership and my view counts have dropped significantly by the tune of like 35 to 40%. And I was thinking about why that could have happened. I could take some of the blame. Maybe my content has not been what people want to hear, or maybe, you know, people just tire of hearing from me so much, and that's fine. I can totally take that. That's understandable. But I noticed one thing in the algorithm is that if I'm watching a more conservative or more than conservative channel, like something along the bent of what I'm doing, that instead of the autoplay keeping me in that channel, it's going to bump me. Usually I get bumped to Fox News, or like you said earlier today, to Jordan Peterson. And I believe that's probably happening to everybody watching channels like mine. I guess if you want to call them the truther ones, that autoplays, suggested videos to the side, all of those things that used to favor the channel that you're actually watching, that in the sense that they will drive you, not just, they won't drive you away like what's happening now. Like I noticed that if anyone's watching my channel, they're driven away by the algorithm. And what do you think about that?
I think the algorithm is classifying a lot of content into only a few discrete categories, either acceptable narrative or non-acceptable narrative or a gray area. And that algorithm has become pretty refined over the past 3 to 4 months. And I think we're not the only ones that are very concerned about the hidden control of what kind of information we're seeing, even though we're basically telling are telling YouTube exactly the content that we like because we interact with it and we subscribe to it, and yet it's directing other content to us. It seems like a hidden form of control of that
Totally.
information, and it's very inconspicuous, so people don't 100% notice it, but it does have a huge impact because it adds another level of friction for viewers like us to actually access the content that we think is meaningful.
That's the bottom line right there. They know you've gone to a particular channel. Let's say that someone is watching my channel. They're in on my channel. It used to be 2 or 3 years ago when I went from like 500 subscribers to over 10,000 in just a year. It used to be that if a person went in there, they would see one of my videos and then it would autoplay to another one of my videos, and they could start a podcast of mine before they lay down to bed and wake up the next morning. There could be a fifth, sixth, or seventh podcast playing. Now they didn't hear everything consciously that was said, but it would still be in that particular channel where you started. Sometimes it would divert you out of that, but not all the time, and that's really hurt channels like mine. The other aspect of my channel is that I never monetized because I didn't want people to have to watch offensive advertising that they wouldn't want to receive. And I didn't want them to get sidetracked or diverted from just watching the content. And part of me wonders too, if that flags me again, because of the fact that, of course, I've heard the equation is that for every video where there's an ad, that YouTube takes 45% and the content maker gets 55%. And why wouldn't they drive people away from a non-advertising channel like mine to one that does?
Yeah, there are a number of reasons why the content like yours is downranked. I think we're definitely onto something when we say it certainly has to do with the message, but it also has to do with, of course, with our ads algorithm and being able to generate ad dollars. Publishers need to be ranked higher to get traffic and to be able to sell their space. Advertisers, and YouTube supports that kind of contract between the two sides of the market.
Did you hear that Joe Rogan signed $100 million deal with Spotify? I think it was today, and he's going to not have any of his podcasts anymore on YouTube or iTunes. And I want to just say a caveat that I know Joe has the all-seeing eye and the forehead at the beginning, and I don't listen to him myself. I've heard a few of his shows, and he's had some interesting guests and whatnot, but I don't really support his show. I'm not saying I do, but I'm saying that he may be a part of the whole, the whole system, the whole cabal. He probably is, but I've heard him in the past, or I heard tales of him complaining about the restrictions YouTube was putting on him. And so now he's leaving and Spotify's paying him this outrageous sum, and YouTube is going to lose him.
That's interesting. Well, I don't think YouTube is gonna miss the revenue that he was generating. I think
he got over, I think it was something like, I don't know, 45 million views a month. I mean, he'll drop a podcast in the same day it'll have 1 million views. He has several million subscribers, but like you say, it's probably still a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, and it's a small price for YouTube to pay to be able to control the content.
That's a good point. And maybe, sometimes I think, I don't know if you noticed when Steven Crowder, these are, I think they're all controlled opposition, but Steven Crowder and Alex Jones and now him, I think sometimes they take people like them and use them as an example, even though I think they're part of it. I think they know what's going on, but they use them as an example to put fear in the rest of us. And maybe they're using this whole thing with Joe leaving to get the rest of us to think we got to leave. But I got to tell you, I put one video on BitChute. That interface is awful. It's terrible. I mean, it's nothing compared to YouTube in terms of ease of use and just the way you interact with it. It's the worst. And I guess it could go to Vimeo, which is expensive, but they're controlling the narrative now too, and everybody's, you know, stepping up the almost like communist level controls at all these places.
Yeah, and it's amazing that they were able to achieve it as a private company that started as an open platform, as crowdsourced content, and now they're policing it very much with tools that are very similar to state-like control of information.
Totally.
So
remember when
it's a
Mark
very
Zuckerberg said something about the Chinese have it right, you know, or he implied it at least.
That's right. That's right.
You know, I want to say one more thing about this. You can go if you want, but I want to talk about this final thing related to that is that I wonder if, you know, people talk about the CIA had a hand in starting Facebook and Google and all that, and it very well could be. But I often wonder, and this is me putting my tinfoil on my head again, because I like to do this. I often wonder if they purposely got everybody together in platforms like that where they were open source, where people could, well, open source is not the right terminology, but everybody could use it. We couldn't program it like open source, but we could at least use it and do whatever we want, say almost anything you want. Free speech abounded. But then they got everybody to say what they were going to say. They got everybody to tell who all their friends were on Facebook. And they built these incredible dossiers on each and every one of us that Hitler and Himmler, whoever his assistant was, would have salivated for in Nazi Germany. I mean, it's amazing how much information they have on everybody now. Not that I'm scared of it, and we as Christians, we don't fear it, but they certainly used it in such a way before they turned it off to be able to identify each and every person.
Yeah, it's amazing how much information that people have volunteered on each of these platforms and are just in the hands of only a couple companies.
Yeah, and they're companies that were high on LSD and worshiping the devil. You know, I guess that's a great way to conclude. Jeff, once again, it was riveting talking and hearing you tell about what goes on in Silicon Valley and what went on there, how it started. To me, what I leave with is it's just amazing how far ahead they were thinking about the future. You know, I keep going back to that movie Metropolis and the whole idea of the ghost in the machine and in that robot. But to think that was a constant throughout the 20th century, from 1928 when that movie was made right up to the 60s with the LSD experiments. And you have to wonder how much demons and fallen angels played a role in educating the people who are taking those hallucinogenics and LSD and whatever and trying to operate at the highest efficiencies. You have to wonder how much they influence demons and fallen angels influence them. And I would say 100%. That's what I'm leaving with.
Yeah, it's really remarkable, Doug, how much LSD and out-of-body experiences really influence the creation of modern computers, and we can't overlook that connection. We definitely have to be vigilant over what we see, what comes through computers, and we have to put on the full armor. As always.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, what a portal, and then this is a whole other video, but what a portal for pornography these computers became. I mean, billions and billions of dollars made and trillions of views of things that we weren't meant to see. And it's been so easy for them to get people to just drop their guard and look at it because it's so easily accessible. Well, Jeff, thank you again for joining us. And I really do hope that you'll come back again if I haven't worn out my welcome with you on these discussions.
Well, thank you, Doug. It was my pleasure, as always.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank everybody for staying and watching. You know, didn't play any music on the show today, but we've got lots of free music. If you want to get to that, there's a Reverb Nation link below that you can look at. If you want to see our blog spot. It's withoutspot or blemish.blogspot.com. If you'd like to donate, there's a PayPal link below. Everything we do is free, and we just want to be of service to people, and we praise God for that. And we also praise God for those that have donated that enable us to keep making content, and we're going to keep making it. And to my earlier point, you know, I don't care about the views. It's never been about the views. We don't make any money on the views. But if you want to help the chances of this being seen more, be sure to share. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, comment. Be sure to get the word out. If it's helped you, it might help some other people. And that's the only way that we're really going to keep the video counts on messages like these up, is if we actually do the heavy lifting. I know, just speaking of some of the administrative aspect of it, you know, at the end there are these end cards that you can put up that I never actually did. So I'm going to start putting those end cards up more and more so that people can at least see those end cards and maybe click through for themselves, since the autoplay will never play another one of my videos after someone's listened to one. So I'm going to try to do a better job on my part to make sure that people have a chance to get more content. And I just appreciate all of you guys for suggesting it to anyone else. And let's go ahead and say goodbye to some people. Melissa, thanks for being here. David, Kimba, Child of the King, Chucky, Melissa, I think I said Melissa already. Chad, glad you're here. Nina, glad you're here. You guys got the wrenches. Thanks for being here and looking through the chat room. And I hope to see you guys again soon on the next podcast for Without Spot or Blemish Ministry. Thanks for joining us.